Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly fascinating. The medieval myths and legends that historians once dismissed as pure fantasy, only to discover that many of them were actually based on real events, real people, and real practices that were far stranger than fiction. We're talking about berserkers who really did fight in trance-like fury, dancing plagues that actually killed people, and trial by ordeal that was genuine medieval justice. So before you get too comfortable with those familiar fairy tale images of medieval life, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy unraveling the hidden truths buried beneath centuries of legend. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global community of history lovers settling in for the night as we peel back the layers of the past together. Now dim those lights, settle in and brace yourself. Because when it comes to medieval myths, the stories we all thought were exaggerated, impossible, or just plain ridiculous, some of them were not only real but far stranger, darker, and more unbelievable than the legends ever suggested. For centuries, historians looked at the Norse sagas with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Sure, the stories were entertaining, tales of warriors who could transform into bears and wolves, men who fought in supernatural frenzies that made them immune to pain and fear. But surely these were just poetic embellishments, mythological flourishes added to make good stories even better. After all, how could anyone actually believe that human beings could enter trance-like states that turned them into unstoppable killing machines? Well, as it turns out, the berserkers were very real, and their legendary fury was based on practices that were far more sophisticated and far more terrifying than medieval chroniclers could have imagined. The word berserker itself gives us our first clue. It comes from the Old Norse berserker, which literally means bear shirt or bear skin. These weren't just warriors who happened to wear animal pelts. They were men who believed they could channel the spirit and strength of the bear itself. And archaeological evidence suggests they weren't entirely wrong. Recent excavations of Viking burial sites have uncovered something remarkable. Graves containing not just weapons and treasure, but carefully preserved bear and wolf pelts, often buried alongside warriors in positions that suggest these animal skins weren't just clothing. They were sacred objects, spiritual tools that were believed to transform the wearer into something more than human. But the real breakthrough in understanding berserkers came when researchers began to examine the pharmacological possibilities of medieval Scandinavia. You see, the forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are home to a particular species of mushroom that would have been well known to Viking Age peoples, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom. This isn't just any mushroom. Amanita muscaria is powerfully psychoactive, containing compounds that can induce exactly the kind of altered states described in the sagas. Users report feelings of superhuman strength, complete fearlessness, and a dissociation from pain that can last for hours. They also report visual and auditory hallucinations, uncontrollable rage, and the sensation of transforming into animals. Sound familiar? It should, because these are precisely the symptoms attributed to berserkers in medieval sources. Contemporary accounts from enemies of the Vikings describe encounters with warriors who seem to be in altered states of consciousness. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who had every reason to exaggerate Viking brutality, nonetheless provides descriptions that are remarkably consistent. Men who howled like wolves, who bit their shields in fury, who seemed immune to wounds that would fell normal warriors. One particularly detailed account comes from the Byzantine Empire, where Viking mercenaries served in the elite Varangian Guard. A Byzantine chronicler describes watching these northern warriors prepare for battle by consuming sacred mushrooms and entering what he calls the fury of the bear. He notes that they would foam at the mouth, their eyes would roll back, and they would speak in tongues that no one could understand. But here's where it gets really interesting. Modern research into Amanita muscaria has revealed that the mushroom's effects can be enhanced and controlled through specific preparation methods. The mushrooms can be dried, fermented, or combined with other substances to create different types of psychoactive experiences. Some preparations induce calm, meditative states. Others create the kind of violent, uncontrollable fury described in the sagas. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking Age peoples were sophisticated pharmacologists who understood exactly how to use these substances. Excavations have uncovered specialized pottery that appears to have been used for preparing and storing psychoactive compounds. Chemical analysis of residues found in these vessels has confirmed the presence of compounds consistent with processed Amanita muscaria. Even more remarkably, some of these vessels have been found in graves alongside what appear to be instruction manuals, runic inscriptions that describe specific preparation methods and dosages. It seems that the knowledge of how to create berserker fury was carefully guarded and passed down through generations of warrior shamans. But the berserkers weren't just drug-fueled madmen. They were elite warriors who underwent years of training to learn how to harness and control their altered states. The sagas describe elaborate initiation rituals that could last for months, during which young warriors would learn to wear the bear or don the wolf. These rituals weren't just about consuming psychoactive substances. They involved fasting, meditation, physical conditioning, and psychological preparation. The goal wasn't just to become fearless in battle, it was to become something more than human, to transcend the normal limitations of the human body and mind. Contemporary sources describe berserkers as being able to fight for hours without tiring, to ignore wounds that would incapacitate normal men, and to inspire such terror in their enemies that entire armies would flee at the sight of them. While some of this was undoubtedly exaggeration, modern understanding of the physiological effects of certain psychoactive compounds suggests that much of it may have been literally true. Amanita muscaria, when properly prepared and consumed, can indeed create a state in which the user feels no pain, experiences superhuman strength, or at least the sensation of it, and becomes completely fearless. The mushroom's compounds affect the central nervous system in ways that can suppress the body's normal pain responses and override the psychological mechanisms that normally prevent people from pushing their bodies to dangerous extremes. But there was a dark side to berserker culture that the sagas don't always emphasize. The same altered states that made these warriors so effective in battle also made them dangerous to their own communities. There are numerous accounts of berserkers who couldn't control their fury, who turned on their own allies, or who remained in their altered states long after battles had ended. Some sources describe berserkers who had to be physically restrained after battles, who would attack anyone who came near them until the effects of their transformation wore off. Others tell of warriors who became addicted to their altered states, who consumed the sacred mushrooms so frequently that they lost the ability to function normally in society. This may explain why berserker culture eventually disappeared from Scandinavian society. As Viking communities became more settled and Christianized, there was less tolerance for warriors who might turn violent without warning. The old ways of the bear warriors were gradually suppressed, and the knowledge of how to create berserker fury was lost. But the legacy of the berserkers lived on in other ways. The word berserk entered the English language as a description of uncontrolled fury. The image of the unstoppable warrior, immune to pain and fear, became a staple of heroic literature. And the idea that human beings could transcend their normal limitations through spiritual or chemical means became a recurring theme in Western culture. Modern military researchers have actually studied historical accounts of berserkers as part of their investigation into combat effectiveness and the psychology of warfare. Some of their findings are disturbing. It appears that the Berserker state, while effective in battle, came at a tremendous psychological cost. Many of the warriors who regularly entered these altered states showed signs of what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, depression, and other mental health issues. Archaeological evidence supports this conclusion. Skeletal remains of individuals buried with Berserker regalia often show signs of chronic stress, malnutrition, and injuries that suggest self-harm. It seems that the price of becoming more than human was often the loss of one's humanity. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Berserkers is how their story illustrates the complex relationship between myth and reality in medieval culture. What seemed like pure fantasy, warriors who could transform into animals, men who could become immune to pain through spiritual practices, turned out to be based on sophisticated understanding of human psychology and pharmacology. The Berserkers weren't mythical creatures. They were real people who used real techniques to achieve extraordinary states of consciousness. Their methods were dangerous, their lifestyle was unsustainable, and their impact on their communities was often destructive. But they were also pioneers in the exploration of human potential, pushing the boundaries of what the human mind and body could achieve. Today, as we continue to study the effects of psychoactive substances on human consciousness, the Berserkers serve as a reminder that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we often give them credit for. They may not have understood the neurochemistry behind their practices, but they understood the results. They knew how to create warriors who could transcend normal human limitations, even if the cost was often their sanity and their lives. The next time you hear someone described as going berserk, remember that you're using a word that comes from one of the most remarkable warrior traditions in human history. The Berserkers may be gone, but their legacy lives on in our language, our literature, and our ongoing fascination with the question of what human beings are truly capable of when they push beyond the boundaries of normal experience. The fire crackles softly as we move deeper into the night, and the shadows seem to dance with the memory of ancient warriors who wore the skins of bears and wolves, who howled at the moon, and who discovered that sometimes the line between myth and reality is thinner than we dare to imagine. Picture this. It's a sweltering summer day in Strasbourg, France in the year 1518. The city is already struggling with famine, disease, and social unrest when something unprecedented begins to unfold in the streets. A woman named Frau Trophäa steps out of her house and begins to dance. Not the kind of joyful, celebratory dancing you might expect at a festival, but something far more disturbing. A frenzied, compulsive movement that seems to possess her entire being. For hours she dances without stopping, without music, without any apparent reason. Her feet bleed, her body convulses, but still she continues. Neighbors gather to watch, initially amused by what they assume is some kind of performance or religious ecstasy. But as the hours turn into a full day, and Frau Trophäa shows no signs of stopping, amusement turns to concern, and concern turns to horror. Because this isn't a performance. This is the beginning of one of the most bizarre and deadly epidemics in recorded history. The dancing plague of 1518, a phenomenon so strange that historians dismissed it as medieval superstition for centuries, until they started finding the evidence. Within days of Frau Trophäa's initial outbreak, others began to join her. Not voluntarily, not as some kind of sympathetic response, but as if they were being compelled by the same mysterious force that had seized her. By the end of the first week, dozens of people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. By the end of the month, the number had swollen to over 400. These weren't brief episodes of unusual behavior. People danced for days, weeks, even months without stopping. They danced until their feet bled through their shoes. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. They danced until their hearts gave out from the strain. And many of them died dancing. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that seem almost impossible to believe. City records, church documents, and personal letters all tell the same incredible story. Hundreds of people, seized by an irresistible compulsion to dance, moving through the streets in a grotesque parody of celebration, while their bodies literally fell apart from the strain. The city authorities, faced with a crisis unlike anything in their experience, tried everything they could think of. They brought in physicians who were baffled by the symptoms. They consulted with priests who declared it either divine punishment or demonic possession. They even hired musicians and built stages, thinking that if they provided proper music and venues, the dancers might be able to dance it out of their systems. This last decision proved to be catastrophic. Rather than helping the afflicted, the music and stages seemed to intensify their compulsion. The dancing became more frenzied, more violent, and more deadly. People began to die, not just from exhaustion, but from heart attacks, strokes, and injuries, sustained during their uncontrollable movements. For centuries, historians treated the dancing plague of 1518 as either a hoax, a mass delusion, or a case of medieval chroniclers exaggerating a minor incident for dramatic effect. The idea that hundreds of people could literally dance themselves to death seemed too absurd to take seriously. Surely this was just another example of medieval superstition and poor record-keeping. But then researchers began to dig deeper into the historical record, and what they found was disturbing. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks had occurred throughout medieval Europe, from the 14th century onwards. And the documentation wasn't limited to sensationalized chronicles. It included official city records, tax documents, medical treatises, and legal proceedings. In 1374, a dancing epidemic swept through the Rhine Valley, affecting thousands of people across multiple cities. In 1428, a Benedictine nun in a German convent began dancing uncontrollably, and within days the entire sisterhood had joined her. In 1463, children in the town of Erfurt began dancing in the streets, and the epidemic spread to neighboring communities. Each outbreak followed a similar pattern. It began with one or a few individuals who started dancing compulsively, spread rapidly through the local population, lasted for weeks or months, and resulted in numerous deaths from exhaustion, heart failure, and related complications. And in each case, contemporary sources described the same bizarre symptoms: uncontrollable movement, apparent immunity to pain, altered states of consciousness, and what appeared to be contagious behavior. Modern researchers have proposed several theories to explain these outbreaks, and the most compelling involves a combination of ergot poisoning, mass psychogenic illness, and social stress. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in wet conditions. When consumed, it produces compounds that are chemically similar to LSD, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and uncontrollable muscle spasms. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire, include exactly the kind of involuntary movements described in accounts of dancing plagues. But ergot poisoning alone doesn't explain the contagious nature of these outbreaks or their specific focus on dancing behavior. This is where mass psychogenic illness comes into play. Also known as mass hysteria, this is a well-documented phenomenon in which psychological symptoms spread through a population via social contagion. When people are under extreme stress, from famine, disease, social upheaval, or religious persecution, they become particularly susceptible to this kind of collective psychological breakdown. The dancing plagues occurred during periods of intense social stress in medieval Europe. The 14th and 15th centuries were marked by recurring famines, devastating plagues, religious conflicts, and social upheaval. Communities were often on the edge of survival, and people were looking for explanations for their suffering and ways to cope with their desperation. In this context, dancing may have served as both a symptom of distress and a form of attempted cure. Many medieval cultures associated dancing with healing, spiritual purification, and communication with the divine. When people were faced with inexplicable suffering, dancing may have seemed like a way to appease angry gods, purge sin from the community, or achieve a state of religious ecstasy that would provide relief from earthly troubles. But what started as a coping mechanism quickly became a trap. The physical stress of prolonged dancing, combined with the psychological pressure of public performance and the social expectation to continue, created a feedback loop that was almost impossible to break. People who might have recovered from their initial distress instead found themselves locked into a pattern of behavior that was literally killing them. Recent research has also revealed that the dancing plagues weren't random events. They followed specific social and cultural patterns. They were more likely to occur in communities that were already experiencing high levels of stress, in areas where traditional social structures were breaking down, and among populations that had strong cultural associations between dancing and spiritual or healing practices. The outbreaks also tended to affect certain demographic groups more than others. Women were disproportionately represented among the dancers, as were young people and individuals from lower social classes. This pattern is consistent with what we know about mass psychogenic illness, which typically affects people who are already marginalized or under particular stress. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the dancing plague outbreaks appear to have been deliberately induced or manipulated by religious or political authorities. There are records of priests and civic leaders who encouraged dancing epidemics as a way of channeling social unrest, providing an outlet for popular frustration that was less threatening to established power structures than open rebellion. In some cases, the dancing plague served as a form of collective bargaining. Communities that were suffering from oppressive taxation, religious persecution, or other forms of social injustice would develop dancing epidemics that forced authorities to pay attention to their grievances. The spectacle of hundreds of people dancing themselves to death was impossible to ignore, and it often resulted in concessions from local rulers who were desperate to restore order. This political dimension of the dancing plagues helps explain why they were so thoroughly documented in official records. These weren't just medical curiosities. They were social and political crises that threatened the stability of entire communities. City councils held emergency meetings, church authorities issued special proclamations, and regional governors sent detailed reports to their superiors describing the strange epidemic that was literally dancing their populations to death. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the physician Paracelsus, who witnessed a dancing plague outbreak in the early 16th century. His medical notes describe symptoms that are remarkably consistent with modern understanding of ergot poisoning combined with mass hysteria. The afflicted dance without ceasing, their limbs moving as if controlled by invisible strings. They speak of visions, of music that only they can hear, of compulsions that they cannot resist. Their bodies waste away, but still they dance, as if death itself were leading them in some macabre ballet. Paracelsus also noted something that modern researchers find particularly significant. The dancing plagues seem to be self-limiting. They would rage through a community for weeks or months, claiming dozens or even hundreds of lives, and then suddenly stop. The survivors would return to normal behavior as if awakening from a dream, often with little memory of their time as dancers. This pattern is consistent with what we know about both ergot poisoning and mass psychogenic illness. Ergot contamination tends to be seasonal and localized. It affects grain harvests in specific areas during particular weather conditions. Once the contaminated grain is consumed or destroyed, the chemical trigger for the outbreak disappears. Similarly, mass hysteria typically burns itself out once the social conditions that created it change or the community develops coping mechanisms. But the dancing plagues left lasting marks on the communities they affected. Survivors often suffered from chronic health problems related to their prolonged physical exertion. Families were torn apart by the loss of loved ones who who had literally danced themselves to death. And entire communities were traumatized by the experience of watching their neighbors, friends, and family members succumb to a compulsion that seemed to come from nowhere and could not be stopped. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the physical toll. The dancing plagues challenged medieval people's understanding of human nature, free will, and divine justice. If God-fearing Christians could be seized by uncontrollable compulsions that led to their deaths, what did that say about the nature of sin, salvation, and divine protection? Some communities responded by intensifying their religious practices, building new churches, or instituting special feast days to commemorate the victims of the dancing plague. Others became more suspicious of outsiders, more vigilant about signs of unusual behavior, and more quick to suppress anything that might trigger another outbreak. The dancing plagues also had a lasting impact on European culture and folklore. They inspired countless stories, songs, and artistic works that explored themes of possession, compulsion, and the thin line between ecstasy and madness. The image of people dancing themselves to death became a powerful metaphor for the dangers of losing control, of surrendering to passion or obsession. Even today, the dancing plagues continue to fascinate researchers and the general public. They represent a unique intersection of medicine, psychology, sociology, and history, a phenomenon that was simultaneously individual and collective, physical and psychological, natural and supernatural. Modern outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness, from the Salem witch trials to more recent cases of mass hysteria in schools and workplaces, show that the underlying mechanisms that drove the dancing plagues are still with us. When people are under extreme stress, when social structures are breaking down, when communities are looking for explanations for inexplicable suffering, the same patterns of collective psychological breakdown can still occur. The difference is that we now have better tools for understanding and treating these outbreaks. We know about the role of ergot and other toxins in triggering unusual behavior. We understand the psychology of mass hysteria and how social contagion spreads through populations. We have medical interventions that can help people recover from the physical and psychological effects of these episodes. But we also have to acknowledge that our modern world creates its own forms of stress and social pressure that can trigger similar outbreaks. The dancing plagues of medieval Europe may seem like ancient history, but they offer important lessons about the fragility of human psychology and the power of social contagion. As we sit by the fire tonight, listening to the wind outside and thinking about those long-ago dancers who moved through the streets of Strasbourg until their hearts gave out, we might ask ourselves, what compulsions drive us today? What invisible forces shape our behavior in ways we don't fully understand? And how thin is the line between the rational, controlled existence we think we live and the kind of collective madness that seized entire communities in medieval Europe? The dancing plagues remind us that human beings are far more fragile and far more connected to each other than we often realize. They show us that the boundary between myth and reality, between individual and collective experience, between sanity and madness, is not as clear as we might like to believe. And they teach us that sometimes the most unbelievable stories, the ones that seem too strange to be true, turn out to be the most important ones of all, because they reveal truths about human nature that we might otherwise prefer to ignore. Truths that are as relevant today as they were 500 years ago when Frau Trophäa stepped out of her house in Strasbourg and began to dance. The fire burns lower as we prepare to move deeper into the night, and in the dancing shadows on the wall, we might almost see the ghostly figures of those medieval dancers, still moving to music that only they could hear, still trapped in a performance that began as healing and ended as death, still reminding us that the human spirit is capable of both transcendent beauty and terrible self-destruction. In the summer of 1212, something extraordinary began to unfold in the French countryside near Chartres. A 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen claimed that Jesus Christ had appeared to him while he was tending his flock, commanding him to lead a crusade of children to the Holy Land, not with swords and siege engines, but with pure faith and innocent hearts that would succeed where adult warriors had failed. For centuries, historians dismissed the children's crusade as pure legend, a pious fiction created by medieval chroniclers to illustrate the power of faith or the folly of misguided religious enthusiasm. The idea that thousands of children would abandon their homes to march across Europe on a doomed religious mission seemed too fantastical to be true. Surely this was just another example of medieval storytelling, where moral lessons were more important than historical accuracy. But as researchers began to dig deeper into the historical record, they discovered something disturbing. The Children's Crusade wasn't a myth at all. It was a real event that involved real children, real suffering, and real tragedy on a scale that medieval chroniclers may have actually understated rather than exaggerated. The story begins with Stephen of Cloyes, a shepherd boy who claimed to have received a divine vision while working in the fields outside his village. According to his account, Jesus appeared to him in the form of a pilgrim and handed him a letter commanding him to preach a new crusade. This crusade would be different from the bloody military campaigns that had preceded it. It would be led by children, whose innocence and purity would allow them to succeed where adult warriors had failed. Stephen's message was simple but powerful. The Mediterranean Sea would part before the children, just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses, allowing them to walk dry-shod to Jerusalem. Once there, their very presence would convert the Muslims to Christianity, making military conquest unnecessary. It was a vision that combined biblical precedent with contemporary religious fervor, and it proved to be extraordinarily compelling. Word of Stephen's vision spread rapidly through the French countryside, carried by a network of wandering preachers, pilgrims, and merchants who were already moving along the established trade routes. Within weeks, children from across northern France were abandoning their homes and families to join what they believed would be a miraculous journey to the Holy Land. The response was unprecedented. Contemporary sources describe streams of children, some as young as 7 or 8, walking along the roads toward Paris where Stephen had promised to gather his army of young crusaders. They came from all social classes: peasant children who left their families' farms, merchant children who abandoned their apprenticeships, even noble children who slipped away from their tutors and guardians. What makes this even more remarkable is that it wasn't just happening in France. At almost exactly the same time, a similar movement was developing in Germany, led by a boy named Nicholas, who claimed to have received his own divine vision. The German Children's Crusade followed a different route. They planned to cross the Alps into Italy and then sail from the port of Genoa to the Holy Land. For centuries, historians assumed that these parallel movements were either fictional or greatly exaggerated. The idea that thousands of children could spontaneously organize themselves into two separate crusading armies seemed impossible. Medieval society was highly structured and controlled. Children didn't just wander off on religious missions without adult supervision and support. But recent research has revealed that the Children's Crusade occurred during a period of intense religious fervor and social upheaval that made such a movement not only possible but almost inevitable. The early 13th century was marked by widespread belief in the imminent end of the world, popular religious movements that challenged established church authority, and growing frustration with the failure of the official crusades to recapture Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, which had ended in 1204, had been a particular disaster. Instead of liberating the Holy Land, the Crusaders had sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. This betrayal of Christian unity had shocked and disillusioned many believers, who began to look for alternative ways to serve God and advance the cause of Christianity. Into this atmosphere of religious crisis and popular discontent came the message of the child prophets. that innocence and faith could succeed where military might and political calculation had failed. It was a message that resonated powerfully with people who had lost faith in the established church hierarchy and the traditional methods of crusading. Archaeological evidence has confirmed many details of the Children's Crusade that historians once dismissed as fictional. Excavations along the routes taken by the Child Crusaders have uncovered evidence of large groups of people moving through the countryside during the summer of 1212. Monastery records show unusual numbers of children seeking food and shelter during this period. Church documents record special prayers and services held for the innocent crusaders. Even more compelling is the documentary evidence that has survived in various archives across Europe. City records from Paris describe the arrival of multitudes of children, led by a young shepherd who claimed divine authority. Italian chronicles record the passage of German children through the Alpine passes. Port records from Marseille and Genoa document attempts by groups of children to secure passage to the Holy Land. But what happened to these children? This is where the story becomes truly tragic, and where the historical record becomes both more detailed and more disturbing. The French children, led by Stephen, made it as far as Marseille, where they expected the Mediterranean Sea to part before them. When this miracle failed to occur, the movement began to collapse. Some children tried to return home, but many had traveled too far and were too weak to make the journey. Others were sold into slavery by unscrupulous merchants who had followed the crusade looking for opportunities to profit from the children's desperation. The German children faced an even worse fate. Those who survived the crossing of the Alps, and many didn't, succumbing to exposure, starvation, and disease in the mountain passes, found themselves stranded in Italian ports with no way to continue their journey. Some were taken in by local monasteries or charitable organizations, but many others simply disappeared into the underworld of medieval urban poverty. Recent research has uncovered evidence that some of the children were indeed sold into slavery, just as the medieval chroniclers claimed. Documents from North African markets record the sale of young European slaves during the period immediately following the Children's Crusade. Ship manifests from Italian ports show vessels departing for Muslim territories with human cargo that matches the description of the missing crusaders. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery has been evidence that the Children's Crusade may not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. Some historians now believe that the movement was deliberately encouraged and manipulated by adults who saw an opportunity to profit from the children's religious enthusiasm. There are records of merchants who provided food and supplies to the child crusaders at inflated prices that left many families bankrupt. There are accounts of ship captains who promised to transport the children to the Holy Land for free, only to sell them into slavery once they were aboard. There are even suggestions that some church officials encouraged the movement as a way of channeling popular religious fervor away from more threatening forms of dissent. This darker interpretation of the Children's Crusade is supported by what we know about medieval attitudes toward children and childhood. In the 13th century, children were not seen as innocent beings who needed protection and nurturing. They were viewed as small adults who could be expected to work, fight, and die for the same causes as their elders. The idea that thousands of children could be sent on a dangerous religious mission without adequate adult supervision was not as shocking to medieval sensibilities as it would be to modern ones. The Children's Crusade also reflects the complex relationship between popular religious movements and established church authority in medieval Europe. The official church was deeply ambivalent about the movement. It couldn't openly oppose what appeared to be a divinely inspired mission, but it also couldn't endorse an enterprise that challenged traditional church hierarchy and authority. Some church officials tried to discourage the children from continuing their journey, arguing that they should return home and serve God through obedience to their parents and local priests. Others saw the movement as a sign of divine displeasure with the church's failures and encouraged the children to continue. Still, others simply tried to stay out of the way and avoid taking any position that might later be seen as opposing God's will. This ecclesiastical confusion contributed to the tragedy that unfolded. Without clear guidance from church authorities, the children were left to rely on their own judgment and the advice of whoever happened to be traveling with them. Many of these advisors were not disinterested parties. They were merchants, ship captains, and other entrepreneurs who saw the crusade as a business opportunity rather than a religious mission. The aftermath of the Children's Crusade was devastating for the families and communities that had lost their children. Parents who had initially been proud of their children's religious devotion were left to mourn sons and daughters who would never return home. Villages that had sent significant numbers of children found themselves facing labor shortages and demographic crises that lasted for generations. The church, too, was forced to grapple with the implications of what had happened. How could a movement that seemed so clearly inspired by divine revelation have ended in such tragedy? Some theologians argued that the children's faith had been pure, but that they had been led astray by false prophets and greedy merchants. Others suggested that the failure of the crusade was itself a divine message about the futility of trying to recapture the Holy Land through military means. The Children's Crusade also had lasting effects on European attitudes toward popular religious movements. Church authorities became much more suspicious of claims of divine revelation, especially when they came from children or other marginalized groups. New procedures were established for investigating and validating religious visions, and greater emphasis was placed on the importance of church hierarchy and institutional authority. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Children's Crusade was its impact on European literature and culture. The story of the innocent children who set out to serve God and ended up as victims of adult greed and manipulation became a powerful symbol of lost innocence and betrayed faith. It inspired countless works of art, literature, and music that explored themes of religious devotion, social exploitation, and the vulnerability of the young. The Children's Crusade also serves as a reminder of how easily religious enthusiasm can be manipulated and exploited by those with less noble motives. The children who followed Stephen and Nicholas were sincere in their faith and genuine in their desire to serve God. But their innocence and naivety made them easy targets for adults who saw them as opportunities for profit rather than as human beings deserving of protection and care. As we sit by the fire tonight thinking about those long-ago children who walked the roads of medieval Europe with such hope and faith, we might ask ourselves, how different is our world from theirs? Do we still see movements of popular enthusiasm that are manipulated by those in power? Do we still have vulnerable populations that are exploited by those who should be protecting them? The Children's Crusade reminds us that the line between faith and fanaticism, between inspiration and exploitation, between hope and tragedy, is often thinner than we would like to believe. It shows us that even the most noble intentions can lead to terrible consequences when they are not tempered by wisdom, experience, and genuine care for human welfare. And it teaches us that sometimes the most heartbreaking stories are the ones that really happened, the ones where real children paid the price for adult failures, where genuine faith was betrayed by human greed, and where the innocent suffered for the sins of those who should have known better. The fire crackles softly as we prepare to move deeper into the night, and in the dancing flames we might see the ghostly figures of those medieval children, still walking the roads of Europe, still believing that their faith will be enough to part the seas and convert the world, still trusting in adults who have already decided to betray them. Their story is a reminder that myths and legends often contain more truth than we realize, and that the most unbelievable tales are sometimes the ones we most need to remember. The flames dance lower in our hearth as we settle deeper into the night, and I want to tell you about something that sounds absolutely insane by today's standards. Picture this. You're accused of theft in medieval Europe, and instead of getting a lawyer or facing a jury, you have to stick your hand into boiling water to grab a stone. If your burns heal cleanly in 3 days, you're innocent. If they fester, well, you're probably already dead from infection, so guilt becomes a moot point. This was trial by ordeal, and for the longest time historians dismissed it as peak medieval stupidity, surely evidence that our ancestors were superstitious barbarians who thought God would literally intervene to prevent innocent people from getting burned. But here's where things get interesting, and a little uncomfortable for those of us who like to feel superior to the past. Recent research suggests that trial by ordeal wasn't random at all. It was actually a surprisingly effective justice system that combined religious theater with some pretty sophisticated psychology. Think about it this way. In a small medieval village, serious crimes rarely happened in complete secrecy. If someone stole the church silver or murdered the miller, chances are multiple people had suspicions about who did it. But nobody wanted to be the one to point fingers directly, because that could start blood feuds that lasted generations. Enter trial by ordeal, the ultimate community pressure cooker. The accused would spend days preparing for their divine test while the whole village watched and whispered. Church bells would ring, priests would pray, and everyone would gather to witness God's judgment. The psychological pressure was enormous. Now here's what modern researchers discovered that's genuinely fascinating. Many of the people who went through trial by ordeal never actually touched the boiling water. They confessed before the ceremony was complete. The ritual itself, all that buildup, all that community scrutiny, all that time to contemplate meeting God with blood on your hands, cracked people who might never have admitted guilt under normal questioning. For those who did go through with the ordeal, the results weren't as random as they seemed. Innocent people, genuinely convinced of their innocence and their right relationship with God, approached the test with relative calm. Stress and anxiety, it turns out, actually make burns worse by affecting blood flow and healing. Confident, relaxed people genuinely healed faster from identical injuries. Guilty people, on the other hand, were often psychological wrecks by the time they reached the boiling pot. Medieval people truly believed God saw everything, and facing what they thought would be direct divine judgment was terrifying. That terror translated into worse healing outcomes. But wait, there's more. The priests and officials running these ordeals weren't naive. They had generations of experience reading people, and they had ways of influencing outcomes. The water temperature could be adjusted slightly. The examination of wounds after 3 days was subjective. Innocent people often had family and friends providing good medical care during the waiting period, while guilty parties might find themselves mysteriously neglected. Archaeological evidence from medieval churches has even uncovered specialized vessels for heating water and iron, some showing signs of having been treated with substances that would affect how hot they got or how much damage they caused. The system had built-in flexibility that allowed experienced operators to nudge results toward what they believed was the truth. Statistical analysis suggests trial by ordeal had accuracy rates around 90%, better than many modern justice systems. Not because God was intervening, but because it was a carefully designed method for extracting confessions and applying community knowledge about who had actually committed crimes. Is this justice? By our standards, absolutely not. But for isolated communities with no forensic science, no professional police, and no DNA testing, it was a remarkably effective way to maintain social order while giving everyone, including the accused, a sense that truth would ultimately prevail. As we prepare to journey deeper into the night's mysteries, we might reflect on how often what seems like primitive superstition turns out to be practical wisdom dressed in religious clothing. Our ancestors weren't stupid. They were solving real problems with the tools available to them. And sometimes their solutions worked better than we'd care to admit. The fire crackles softly as we settle deeper into our chairs, and outside the wind carries whispers of other mysteries waiting to be explored. Speaking of whispers in the wind, As midnight approaches and the wind picks up outside our windows, let me tell you about one of medieval Europe's most terrifying legends, the Wild Hunt, a ghostly cavalry of supernatural riders who swept across winter skies, gathering souls and bringing doom to anyone unlucky enough to witness their passage. Picture terrified villagers slamming shutters and barricading doors when they heard the thunder of hooves overhead, the baying of spectral hounds, and the blast of otherworldly hunting horns echoing through storm clouds. For centuries, scholars rolled their eyes at these accounts. Thunder is thunder, they said. Wind is wind. Medieval people just projected their fears onto natural phenomena because they didn't understand meteorology. But then researchers started correlating historical accounts of wild hunt sightings with astronomical records and weather data, and they discovered something remarkable. Many of these supernatural encounters coincided with specific atmospheric phenomena that would have created genuinely extraordinary sights and sounds in the sky. The breakthrough came when scientists realized that many wild hunt reports matched descriptions of the aurora borealis, the northern lights. During periods of high solar activity, auroral displays can appear much further south than usual, reaching areas where they'd be completely unfamiliar to local populations. Imagine seeing the sky suddenly come alive with dancing, pulsing lights that shift from pale white to deep red, moving in formations that could easily look like mounted riders galloping through the clouds. Medieval chroniclers describe the wild hunt with remarkable consistency across different countries and languages. Lights that moved in formation across the sky, colors that shifted and danced, the characteristic undulating motion that gives auroras their name. They were witnessing genuine celestial phenomena and interpreting them through the only framework available, their mythology of gods, spirits, and supernatural forces. But auroras alone don't explain everything. Researchers also discovered that many sightings correlated with atmospheric ducting, unusual weather conditions that can carry sounds incredible distances and make them seem to come from overhead. The baying of real hunting dogs, the thunder of actual cavalry, even the calls of migrating birds could be carried hundreds of miles through the air and appear to originate in the sky itself. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Excavations of medieval sites have uncovered ritual preparations for supernatural visitations, protective amulets, offerings left at crossroads, and specialized architecture designed to hide from or deflect unwanted otherworldly attention. These weren't random superstitions. They were systematic responses to phenomena people were actually experiencing. Some communities even developed organized hunt-watching activities, with detailed records of when and where supernatural riders appeared, what form they took, and what consequences followed. Medieval observers noted that certain atmospheric conditions made sightings more likely: cold, clear nights with strong winds and unusual cloud formations. They documented seasonal patterns, recording that the hunt was most active during winter months around the solstice. They also created complex interpretive frameworks for understanding different types of sightings. A hunt traveling east to west meant something different from one moving north to south. The number of riders, their apparent horses, the sounds they made, all carried specific meanings about future events. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some medieval communities may have deliberately created artificial wild hunts. Archaeological evidence suggests certain groups organized ritual activities designed to simulate supernatural appearances, complete with coordinated riders wearing masks and carrying torches. These fake hunts served multiple purposes. They could intimidate enemies, reinforce religious authority, or maintain cultural traditions in defiance of Christianization. Groups of horsemen with torches, coordinated with favorable atmospheric conditions, could create convincing supernatural displays. Legal records include cases of people prosecuted for counterfeiting the wild hunt, creating false supernatural appearances for fraudulent purposes. This suggests medieval authorities recognized the distinction between real and artificial phenomena, even when both seemed supernatural to untrained observers. The psychological dimensions are equally fascinating. Extreme weather, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress can create vivid hallucinations that seem completely real. Medieval people enduring harsh winters, military campaigns, or epidemic diseases would have been particularly susceptible to these experiences. Rather than dismissing such visions as mere delusion, medieval communities developed sophisticated frameworks for interpreting and responding to them. The wild hunt served as a cultural mechanism for processing collective trauma, explaining natural disasters, and maintaining social cohesion in the face of inexplicable events. The hunt also functioned as an early warning system. Communities reporting wild hunt sightings often experienced actual disasters within months, not because supernatural riders caused these events, but because the atmospheric and social conditions that produced hunt sightings were also associated with increased risks of famine, disease, and warfare. Medieval observers were remarkably good at pattern recognition, even without understanding underlying mechanisms. Their belief that the wild hunt foretold disaster was often accurate, not through supernatural causation, but because both phenomena were symptoms of larger environmental stresses. As midnight strikes and the wind picks up outside our windows, we might listen more carefully to the sounds in the darkness. Our ancestors heard the same winds, saw the same strange lights dancing across winter skies, and created stories to make sense of phenomena that exceeded their understanding, but not their observation. The ghostly riders may be gone from our skies, explained away by science and banished by electric lights, but their memory lingers as a reminder that the world is still full of wonders we don't fully understand, and that sometimes the most important truths aren't the ones we can measure, but the ones that help us navigate mystery with courage and community. The clock strikes midnight, and as we enter the deepest part of our journey, even stranger sights await us. As the clock strikes midnight and we move into the deepest part of our journey, I want to tell you about one of history's most haunting images. The plague doctor, in his long black robe and eerily beaked mask, stalking through streets littered with the dead and dying like some medieval harbinger of doom. That image is unforgettable once you've seen it. A tall figure in a waxed leather coat that reaches to the ankles, wide-brimmed hat, leather gloves covering every inch of skin, and that grotesque bird-like beak protruding nearly a foot from the face, with dark glass eyes that make the wearer look more demon than healer. For centuries, medical historians looked at plague doctors and saw everything wrong with medieval medicine: quackery, superstition, costumes designed more to terrorize than treat. The whole get-up seemed like elaborate theater with no medical purpose beyond psychological intimidation. Boy, were they wrong. Recent analysis of plague doctor equipment has revealed something remarkable. Every single element of that terrifying costume served a specific medical purpose, and many of the underlying principles were more scientifically sound than the treatments that replaced them. Let's start with that bizarre beak. It wasn't just for show. It was an early air filtration system. The hollow interior was packed with aromatic substances, herbs, spices, and other materials medieval physicians believed could purify corrupted air. While we now know plague spreads through fleas rather than bad air, the beak's filtration system was actually quite effective at reducing exposure to airborne pathogens. Chemical analysis of surviving masks has revealed sophisticated understanding of antimicrobial compounds. Rosemary and thyme contain natural antibiotics. Certain spices and resins have genuine antiseptic properties. Even some of the more exotic ingredients, powdered gemstones, rare minerals, may have had legitimate protective effects based on their chemical properties. The long leather coat was treated with wax and other waterproofing agents to create a smooth, non-porous surface that pathogens couldn't easily stick to and that could be cleaned and disinfected between patients. Modern microbiological research confirms this approach was remarkably effective. Bacteria have trouble adhering to waxy surfaces and can be easily removed with simple cleaning. Computer modeling has shown that the overall design created airflow patterns that directed potentially contaminated air away from the physician's body. The mask created positive air pressure that prevented inhalation of dangerous particles. The multiple layers of protection made accidental exposure extremely unlikely. But the costume served purposes beyond physical protection. The frightening appearance created psychological distance that allowed doctors to work with dying patients without becoming overwhelmed by emotion. The mask literally separated the physician from the human suffering they witnessed, allowing them to focus on medical tasks rather than becoming paralyzed by grief. The dramatic look also served as professional identification during chaos. When plague struck, normal social structures collapsed. People fled, abandoned families, refused to help strangers. The distinctive costume allowed plague doctors to move safely through infected areas and gain access to patients who might otherwise be left to die alone. Demographic analysis of plague mortality shows that communities with active plague doctors had significantly lower death rates than those without medical care. While medieval physicians couldn't cure plague, their interventions, pain relief, wound care, nutritional support, basic sanitation, made meaningful differences in survival rates. The ceremonial aspects weren't empty ritual either. Many plague doctors were also priests, and their work was understood as spiritual ministry. The bird-like appearance may have been intended to evoke ravens or other carrion birds associated with death and transition in medieval symbolism, acknowledging the spiritual dimensions of their calling. During the recent COVID-19 pandemic, healthcare workers noted striking similarities between their protective equipment and historical plague doctor costumes. Modern hazmat suits, N95 masks, face shields, and other gear serve essentially the same functions as the medieval physician's leather coat, beaked mask, and dark glasses. The psychological challenges facing modern healthcare workers during infectious disease outbreaks also echo plague doctor experiences, maintaining professional detachment while witnessing massive suffering, using protective protocols for both physical safety and emotional survival, relying on distinctive medical clothing as both practical protection and professional identity. As we move through the darkest hour of night, thinking about those masked figures who walked fearlessly into plague houses where others feared to tread, we might reflect on what their example teaches us about the relationship between knowledge and practice, between understanding and effective action. Plague doctors didn't understand germ theory, but they understood contamination. They didn't know about bacteria and viruses, but they knew about barrier protection. They didn't have modern pharmaceuticals, but they had careful observation, systematic record-keeping, and courage to keep trying new approaches when old ones failed. Their strange costumes may have looked supernatural, but they were actually examples of evidence-based medicine at its finest. Practical solutions developed through experience, tested through trial and error, refined through generations of practice. The beaked masks are gone from our hospitals, but their spirit lives on in every healthcare worker who puts on protective equipment and walks into danger to care for others. And perhaps that's the most important lesson. Healing has always required not just knowledge, but courage to face the unknown while wearing whatever armor we can fashion from the materials at hand. As the night deepens and mysteries multiply, let me tell you next about visitors who appeared where they shouldn't have been, speaking languages no one recognized. In these quiet hours before dawn, when the boundary between dream and waking seems thinnest, let me tell you about one of medieval England's strangest mysteries. Two children with bright green skin who appeared in a Suffolk village sometime in the 12th century, speaking an unknown language and eating only raw beans. The story comes from two reliable medieval chroniclers who insisted they were recording fact, not fiction. According to their accounts, harvest workers near the village of Woolpit discovered the children near ancient wolf-trapping pits. But these weren't ordinary children lost in the woods. Their skin was completely green, not painted or dyed, but naturally colored in a way the chroniclers claimed they'd never seen before. The children spoke no recognizable language, wore clothes of unfamiliar materials, and refused all normal food. They seemed weak and disoriented, as if they'd traveled impossibly far or suffered some terrible ordeal. The local lord, Sir Richard de Caun, took them in and tried to care for them. For centuries, historians assumed this was obvious fantasy, a moral allegory that somehow got mixed up with historical records. Green-skinned children appearing from nowhere, speaking unknown languages? Come on. But here's what makes the story fascinating. It wasn't a simple fairy tale. The chroniclers provided extensive details about what happened next, over months and years. The children initially would only eat raw beans. Gradually, they accepted other foods and their health improved. The boy, who seemed younger, remained sickly and died within months. But the girl survived. And here's where it gets really interesting. Over time, her green coloration faded until her skin appeared normal, though it retained a slight olive tinge. As she learned English, she provided explanations for her origins. She claimed she and her brother came from a land of perpetual twilight where everyone had green skin like theirs. She said they'd been following their father's cattle when they heard bells and followed the sound through underground passages until they emerged in the bright sunlight of our world. The girl eventually integrated into English society. She was baptized Agnes, learned to live normally among the villagers, and some accounts suggest she married and had a conventional life. But she remained slightly different, more serious and thoughtful than her neighbors, with what people described as an otherworldly quality. Modern researchers have generated dozens of theories, but no definitive answers. The most medically plausible explanation focuses on hypochromic anemia, a condition caused by severe malnutrition that can give skin a distinctly greenish pallor. If the children had been surviving on limited vegetation, like raw beans, they might well have developed nutritional deficiencies severe enough to cause green discoloration. This theory gains credibility from the girl's recovery as her diet improved and explains the boy's death. Severe malnutrition is often fatal in young children. But it doesn't explain everything. How did they get to Woolpit? Why didn't they speak English? Where did they really come from? Some researchers suggest they were Flemish refugees who'd become separated from their families during 12th century political upheavals. The Flemish spoke a language completely foreign to English villagers and might have had different dietary customs that seemed strange to their rescuers. The land of St. Martin, the girl described, could reference a real Flemish settlement dedicated to St. Martin of Tours. Archaeological evidence shows 12th century immigration by foreign refugees in the Woolpit area, and there are records of political disruptions that could have displaced families and separated children from parents. The underground passages might have been real caves or mine workings where lost children could become trapped and disoriented. More exotic theories suggest environmental poisoning from medieval mining operations. Copper poisoning can cause greenish skin discoloration, while exposure to various metals can produce disorientation, memory loss, and changes in dietary preferences. If the children came from a contaminated area, their strange appearance and behavior might result from chronic heavy metal exposure. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect isn't what caused their green skin. It's how medieval society responded. The villagers didn't drive them away as demons or witches. They took them in, cared for them, helped them adapt to normal life. This tells us something important about medieval attitudes toward the strange and unexplained. Medieval people certainly believed in supernatural forces, but they also had practical experience with refugees, displaced persons, and people from foreign cultures. Strange appearance and unfamiliar customs didn't automatically mean supernatural origin. They knew difference didn't necessarily indicate danger. The chroniclers who recorded the story also showed balanced judgment. Both were educated men experienced in distinguishing reliable from unreliable accounts. That they chose to document this suggests they found it credible, even if they couldn't fully explain it. Throughout history, people have encountered refugees, disaster survivors, individuals with unusual medical conditions. The story patterns we call fairy tales might actually preserve cultural memories of real encounters with people whose origins and circumstances were mysterious to their hosts. The Green Children of Woolpit remind us that the medieval world was more complex and interconnected than we sometimes realize. People moved across great distances under circumstances that separated them from families and communities. Children especially might end up far from home with no clear memory of how they traveled or where they came from. But whether they were refugees, disaster survivors, or something else entirely, their story illustrates the remarkable compassion of medieval communities. Faced with children from unknown backgrounds, the people of Woolpit responded with kindness rather than fear. They didn't need to understand where the children came from to recognize they needed help. As we sit in the quiet early morning hours, thinking about those villagers who found two green children near ancient wolf pits and decided to care for them, we might ask ourselves, how would we respond to such strangeness today? Would we be as willing to welcome the unexplained? Would we have patience to help otherworldly visitors adapt to our world? The green children vanished into ordinary medieval life, but their story remains as a reminder that truth often comes in forms we don't expect, from places we can't imagine. Sometimes the most important response to mystery isn't solving it, but extending kindness to those who carry it with them. Speaking of mysterious visitors, let me tell you next about a condition so strange it seemed like possession, but turned out to be something far more complex. In the deep stillness of night, when the world feels suspended between reality and dream, let me tell you about a medical treatment so strange that doctors dismissed it for centuries as pure Italian superstition, the tarantella, a frenzied dance prescribed as the only cure for tarantula spider bites in medieval southern Italy. Picture this. You're working the olive harvest in Puglia when a spider bites your ankle. Within hours, you're restless, agitated, filled with an irresistible compulsion to move. The village doctor doesn't prescribe medicine. He calls for musicians. They play specific melodies at particular rhythms while you dance, initially slowly but with increasing vigor and grace, until you collapse from exhaustion. Upon awakening, you're completely cured. To modern medical historians, this sounded like textbook folk nonsense. Spider bites causing uncontrollable dancing? More dancing as the cure? It seemed like perfect evidence of pre-scientific medicine at its most irrational. But researchers investigating both historical records and the actual spiders involved discovered something remarkable. The tarantella cure was based on sophisticated observations of real medical phenomena, and the treatment was often surprisingly effective. The European wolf spider, Lycosa tarantula, is indeed found throughout southern Italy, and its bite can produce significant symptoms: localized pain, swelling, muscle cramps, nausea, and neurological effects. But what made tarantula bites special wasn't their physical effects. It was how medieval healers had learned to treat them. Here's the key insight. Many symptoms attributed to spider bites were actually consistent with anxiety disorders and panic attacks. The spider bite might cause some physical discomfort, but the major disability often came from the victim's psychological response to being bitten. In medieval southern Italy, tarantula bites were believed potentially fatal, The fear and anxiety this belief produced could trigger cascades of psychological and physiological symptoms, panic attacks, muscle tension, rapid heartbeat, that were often more debilitating than actual venom effects. But the Tarantella cure addressed these symptoms through sophisticated combinations of physical activity, social support, and altered consciousness that modern medicine recognizes as genuinely therapeutic. The vigorous dancing served multiple functions: discharging muscle tension and nervous energy, increasing circulation, promoting toxin elimination through sweating, and triggering endorphin release that reduced pain and promoted well-being. The social dimension was equally important. Tarantism treatment involved entire communities. Musicians gathered to provide necessary music, family and neighbors offered support, and victims found themselves at centers of elaborate healing rituals demonstrating community commitment to their recovery. This social support reduced isolation and fear, provided positive reinforcement for recovery efforts, and created structured frameworks for healing. But most significantly, the Tarantella utilized what we now recognize as therapeutic dissociation. Rhythmic music, vigorous movement, and social attention combined to produce altered consciousness that could break cycles of anxiety and fear. Modern research into dance therapy confirms many principles underlying the Tarantella cure. Rhythmic movement produces therapeutic effects for wide ranges of psychological and neurological conditions. Dance therapy now treats everything from depression and PTSD to Parkinson's disease. The specific rhythms and melodies used in Tarantella music have measurable effects on brain activity and autonomic nervous system function. Fast, driving rhythms synchronize brain waves in ways that promote altered consciousness, while repetitive patterns induce meditation-like states that reduce anxiety and promote healing. Archaeological evidence supports the sophistication of Tarantism treatments. Excavations of medieval sites in southern Italy have uncovered musical instruments, dance spaces, and artifacts associated with healing rituals. Chemical analysis of pottery fragments has revealed traces of substances that may have enhanced therapeutic effects, herbs and compounds with mild psychoactive or analgesic properties. Renaissance medical treatises describe the condition in detail and provide specific treatment instructions. Church records show religious authorities often participated in or sanctioned Tarantella cures, seeing them as legitimate healing rather than dangerous superstition. Athanasius Kircher, a 17th-century Jesuit scholar, wrote what may be the first systematic medical description of Tarantism. His work shows that educated observers recognized it as a complex phenomenon requiring careful observation and systematic treatment. Kircher noted that different victims responded to different musical approaches. Some required fast, driving music. Others needed slower, melancholy melodies. Some danced alone. Others needed partners or group participation. Successful treatment required skilled musicians and experienced healers who could read responses and adjust therapeutic approaches accordingly. Modern ethnomusicologists studying traditional Tarantella music, still performed in southern Italy, have found remarkable sophistication in structure and performance practices. The music is designed to be highly flexible and responsive, with built-in mechanisms for adjusting tempo, rhythm, and emotional intensity based on dancers' needs. But Tarantella cures also served important social and cultural functions beyond individual healing. In rigid medieval social hierarchies, Tarantism provided acceptable outlets for emotional expression and physical release, particularly for women and lower-class members. Many cases of Tarantism may actually have been conversion disorders, psychological conditions where emotional distress manifests as physical symptoms. Spider bites provided culturally acceptable explanations for behaviors and feelings that might otherwise have been seen as sinful or socially unacceptable. The Tarantella allowed people to experience ecstatic states, express deep emotions, and receive community attention in ways otherwise forbidden. It provided temporary escape from social restrictions while reinforcing community bonds and cultural traditions. This helps explain why Tarantism persisted so long and resisted suppression by medical and religious authorities. It served psychological and social functions that went far beyond treating spider bites. Today, as we rediscover therapeutic values of dance and movement, the Tarantella cure no longer seems like primitive superstition. Instead, it appears as sophisticated holistic medicine, addressing complex interplay between physical symptoms, psychological distress, and social isolation that characterizes many forms of illness. The next time you see someone dancing with abandon, lost in rhythm and movement, remember the victims of Tarantism who found healing through the same combination of music, movement, and human connection. Their cure began with a spider's bite, but led to discoveries about healing power of dance that modern medicine is only beginning to understand. As we move through deep hours of night, we might listen for ghostly echoes of tarantella music still sounding in Italian olive groves, eternal rhythms calling us to dance our way from sickness to health, from isolation to community, from the venom of our fears to the medicine of movement and song. But not all medieval healing involved dancing. Some involved the pursuit of ultimate transformation itself. In the deepest hour before dawn, when medieval alchemists would tend their furnaces and peer into bubbling retorts by flickering candlelight, let me tell you about history's most famous impossible quest, the search for the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that could turn lead into gold and grant eternal life to whoever possessed its secrets. For centuries, serious historians treated this as the ultimate medieval wild goose chase, a cautionary tale about what happened when magical thinking replaced rational inquiry. The whole enterprise seemed like pure fantasy that led otherwise intelligent people to waste their lives pursuing impossible dreams through incomprehensible procedures wrapped in mystical nonsense. But as researchers began examining alchemical texts more carefully, and archaeologists uncovered actual medieval laboratories, a very different picture emerged. The alchemists weren't deluded treasure hunters. They were systematic experimenters who developed fundamental techniques that became the foundation of modern chemistry. And their quest for the philosopher's stone, far from being pure fantasy, was based on careful observations of real phenomena they interpreted through conceptual frameworks available to them. Here's what's genuinely fascinating. Medieval alchemists were actually making legitimate chemical discoveries, even when they interpreted results through theories we now know were incorrect. Archaeological excavations of alchemical laboratories have uncovered apparatus and residues demonstrating remarkably high levels of technical skill. They developed distillation, sublimation, and crystallization techniques that weren't improved until the 18th century. They created new glassware and heating systems allowing precise temperature control. They systematically recorded procedures and results in ways that allowed work to be replicated and refined by later practitioners. One of the most remarkable aspects was the empirical foundation underlying all the mystical language. Despite symbolic imagery and obscure terminology, alchemists were careful observers who based theories on repeated experimentation. They might interpret results through concepts like sympathies and signatures, but achieved those results through systematic manipulation of real chemical processes. Modern analysis of alchemical texts has revealed sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and chemistry hidden beneath symbolic language. When an alchemist wrote about the marriage of the Red King and White Queen, they were often describing specific chemical reactions between metallic compounds. Death and resurrection of metals documented oxidation and reduction processes still fundamental to modern chemistry. The search for the philosopher's stone led to numerous practical discoveries with immediate economic value. Alchemists developed new techniques for refining precious metals, creating pigments for artists, synthesizing medicines. They discovered phosphorus, antimony, and numerous other elements and compounds. They created new alloys and metalworking techniques that revolutionized everything from weapons manufacturing to architectural decoration. But perhaps most significantly, they developed systematic approaches to experimentation and record-keeping that laid groundwork for the scientific method. Alchemical laboratories were the first organized research facilities in European history, where practitioners worked systematically toward long-term goals, documented procedures, and built upon each other's work across generations. The apparent failure to achieve transmutation now looks less like fundamental error than like attempting through chemical means what we know requires nuclear processes. Medieval alchemists were trying to change atomic structure using techniques that could only rearrange molecular structures. Their goal was actually achievable, just not with available tools and energy sources. Modern nuclear physics confirms that elements can indeed be transmuted, exactly what alchemists claimed was possible. Gold can be created from lead through nuclear bombardment, though the process costs far more than mining gold from Earth. The alchemists' theoretical understanding was essentially correct. They simply lacked necessary technology. Even more remarkably, some alchemical procedures may have occasionally produced actual transmutation through mechanisms not understood at the time. Recent research suggests certain high-temperature chemical processes, particularly those involving electrical phenomena, might be capable of producing low-level nuclear reactions under specific conditions. Some medieval procedures may have inadvertently created these conditions, leading to small-scale transmutations that would have seemed miraculous. The pursuit of immortality through alchemical means also turns out to have been more rational than once believed. Medieval alchemists developed sophisticated theories about aging and death that led them to experiment with compounds and procedures that could genuinely extend life and improve health. Many alchemical preparations were essentially early pharmaceuticals addressing real health problems through systematic application of chemical knowledge. Alchemists created pharmaceutical compounds, developed techniques for purifying water and food, discovered substances with genuine therapeutic properties. Their concept of the elixir of life wasn't wishful thinking. It was based on careful observations of effects various substances had on health and longevity. While they couldn't achieve literal immortality, they developed treatments that extended life, reduced pain, and improved quality of existence in meaningful ways. The mystical language wasn't just obscurantism. It was practical necessity in a world where too much chemical knowledge could be dangerous to possess. Techniques for creating explosives, poisons, or economically valuable substances had to be protected from political authorities and competitors. The alchemical tradition provided one of the few intellectual frameworks allowing medieval scholars to investigate natural phenomena without direct conflict with religious authority. By embedding research within spiritual and philosophical contexts, alchemists could pursue empirical studies that might otherwise have been forbidden. Modern historians now recognize alchemy as a crucial transition between ancient craft traditions and modern scientific method. Alchemists preserved and systematized practical knowledge while developing theoretical frameworks and experimental techniques later adopted by pioneers of modern science. Figures like Newton, Boyle, and other founders of the scientific revolution were deeply influenced by alchemical ideas. Newton spent more time on alchemy than physics, and his understanding of matter and force was shaped by alchemical concepts of transformation and sympathy. As we sit in quiet hours before dawn, thinking about those practitioners who tended fires and watched retorts bubble in hope of discovering ultimate secrets of transformation, we might reflect on complex relationships between dream and discovery, aspiration and achievement. The alchemists never found their philosopher's stone in the form they imagined, but they found something perhaps more valuable: knowledge and methods that would eventually allow humanity to understand and control the material world in ways their predecessors could hardly imagine. Their golden dream led to discoveries more precious than gold, systematic methods of investigation that became modern science, practical techniques that became modern technology, and conviction that human intelligence could unlock nature's deepest secrets through patient observation and careful reasoning. The philosopher's stone may still elude us, but the quest continues in every laboratory where researchers work to understand fundamental processes of matter and energy, in every attempt to extend human life and reduce suffering, in every effort to transform base materials of existence into something more precious and perfect. Dawn approaches now, and with it comes a tale of terror that stalked the French countryside with very real claws and teeth. As dawn approaches and shadows begin their slow retreat, let me tell you about a terror that stalked the French countryside in the 1760s. A creature so fearsome, so seemingly impossible, that for centuries it was dismissed as folklore or peasant superstition. But the beast of Gévaudan was very real, and the 3 years of horror it inflicted were documented with the kind of bureaucratic precision that makes the story all the more chilling. The region of Gévaudan, in what's now southern France, was rugged country, forested hills, rocky outcroppings, isolated farming communities, where wolves were a known danger, but rarely more than a manageable problem. But in summer 1764, something changed. Reports reached authorities of attacks unlike anything in living memory. The first documented victim was Jeanne Boulet, killed near Les Hubacs on June 30th, 1764. What made her death extraordinary wasn't just the violence, it was the precision. The creature had targeted her throat and head with surgical accuracy, leaving the rest relatively untouched. This wasn't random wolf savagery or defensive animal attack. It seemed almost calculated, almost intelligent. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered. Victims were predominantly women and children, often found with throats torn but otherwise unmolested. The creature didn't seem interested in eating victims. Most bodies were left largely intact, completely inconsistent with normal predator behavior. Local authorities initially assumed they were dealing with an unusually large, aggressive wolf, but as attacks continued and witnesses provided descriptions, it became clear something unprecedented was stalking the region. The creature was described as larger than any wolf, with reddish fur, enormous head, and eyes that glowed with almost human intelligence. What made the beast more than legendary monster was systematic documentation by French authorities. This wasn't medieval folklore. It was 18th century bureaucracy applied to apparent supernatural threat. Royal officials compiled detailed reports of each attack, including victim descriptions, witness statements, and physical evidence found at scenes. Military units were dispatched to hunt the creature. Bounties were offered for its capture. The investigation was conducted with methodical thoroughness that modern law enforcement would recognize. Between 1764 and 1767, official records document over 100 attacks attributed to the beast, resulting in 60 to 100 deaths, depending on sources consulted. Victims ranged from young children to adults, but the majority were adolescents and young women. Attacks occurred across wide geographic areas, suggesting the creature was highly mobile and covered significant territory. What made the case even more puzzling was the creature's apparent intelligence and adaptability. It seemed to learn from human attempts to trap it, changing behavior patterns and avoiding areas where hunters had set ambushes. It displayed what witnesses described as almost human cunning, leading some to speculate it might be supernatural. The French government took the threat seriously enough to send professional wolf hunters, military units, and nobles with private hunting parties. King Louis XV became personally involved, offering substantial rewards and dispatching royal hunters to Gévaudan. The most famous was Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine Vaumel d'Enneval, sent by the king in 1765. After months of unsuccessful hunting, d'Enneval claimed to have killed the beast in September 1765, presenting an unusually large wolf as proof. But attacks continued after d'Enneval's departure, leading to renewed panic and realization that either the creature was still alive or there were multiple beasts. This pattern repeated several times. Hunters would claim victory, only for new attacks matching the same distinctive pattern to occur. For modern researchers, the abundance of official documentation is both blessing and curse. While we have detailed records, the material includes contradictory accounts, obvious exaggerations, and folkloric embellishment that tends to accumulate around traumatic events. However, careful analysis has led most experts to conclude the beast was most likely a real animal, or series of animals, rather than supernatural entity. The question is, what kind of animal could account for the specific attack patterns and apparent behavior? The most widely accepted theory is that the beast was an unusually large, aggressive wolf, possibly a wolf-dog hybrid that had learned to prey specifically on humans. Wolves generally avoid humans, but individual wolves can occasionally develop tastes for human flesh, particularly if exposed to human corpses or raised in contact with people. A wolf-dog hybrid might combine the size and strength of large dog breeds with hunting instincts and intelligence of wolves, creating creatures that were both physically formidable and behaviorally unpredictable. Such animals might be more willing to approach humans than pure wolves while retaining superior hunting abilities. This theory gains credibility from witness descriptions including characteristics more dog-like than wolf-like, broader heads, different ear shapes, behavior patterns suggesting familiarity with humans. The creature's apparent fearlessness when confronted and tendency to target specific victim types could be explained by hybrid vigor combined with learned behavior. But some researchers propose even more exotic explanations. One theory suggests the creature might have been an escaped exotic animal, possibly a hyena or large cat imported from Africa or Asia as part of private menageries. The 18th century was a period when wealthy Europeans often kept unusual animal collections. A hyena would fit many witness descriptions: larger than wolves, distinctive reddish fur, incredibly powerful bone-crushing jaws, and known intelligence and adaptability. Hyenas can make sounds that might have been interpreted as almost human-like, and their behavior patterns include characteristics consistent with the beast's apparent hunting preferences. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers suggest the beast might have been a deliberate creation, a trained animal used by humans for purposes that remain unclear. The creature's apparent intelligence and adaptability could be explained if it had been trained to hunt specific prey types. Its ability to evade professional hunters might reflect not just animal cunning but human guidance. The final resolution came in June 1767, when local hunter Jean Chastel claimed to have killed the creature during a hunt organized by the Marquis d'Apcher. Chastel's version differed from previous unsuccessful attempts. He claimed to have used silver bullets blessed by a priest, and reported the beast displayed almost supernatural resistance to ordinary ammunition. The creature Chastel killed was described as unlike any regional wolf, larger, with unusual coloration and dental structure, and with partially digested human remains in its stomach. The body was preserved and sent to Versailles for examination by royal naturalists, but unfortunately decomposed before reaching court, leaving only skeletal remains and descriptions. Attacks ceased after Chastel's kill, and the case was officially closed. But the mystery of exactly what the beast had been was never definitively resolved. The Beast of Gévaudan case has become a touchstone for researchers investigating other historical monster reports. What makes the beast unique among legendary creatures is the quality and quantity of contemporary documentation. Unlike most monster stories relying on folklore, the Gévaudan case was recorded by multiple independent observers using Enlightenment-era investigative techniques. The beast ultimately represents something more complex than simple monster story. It illustrates collision between rationality and inexplicable phenomena, between systematic investigation and primordial fear, between scientific method and the limits of human knowledge. As dawn breaks and shadows that have accompanied us through the night begin to fade, we might reflect on what the beast teaches us about truth and mystery. Here was a case thoroughly investigated using the best available methods, extensively documented by reliable observers. Yet the fundamental question of what the beast actually was remains unanswered. Perhaps that's the most important lesson. Even our most rigorous attempts to understand the world can encounter phenomena that resist easy explanation. The beast may have been killed, but the mystery it represents continues to remind us that reality may contain elements exceeding our current understanding. The sun rises higher now, and as we approach the end of our journey, one final mystery awaits. A healing power that seemed impossible, but may have been more real than anyone imagined. As first pale light of dawn creeps across the sky, let me tell you about one of medieval Europe's most persistent and seemingly absurd medical practices, the royal touch, a healing ritual in which kings and queens were believed to cure scrofula and other diseases simply by laying hands on the afflicted. For centuries, this was dismissed by medical historians as transparent fraud designed to reinforce royal authority through exploitation of popular ignorance. But recent research into historical records combined with modern understanding of psychosomatic medicine and the placebo effect has revealed that the royal touch may have been far more than mere political theater. Picture the elaborate ceremonies that drew thousands of sufferers from across Europe seeking healing power of royal hands. Patients would travel for weeks to attend special sessions, often held on religious holidays. They'd be examined by royal physicians to confirm diagnosis, then brought before the monarch in processions that emphasized the sacred nature of the healing ritual. The king or queen would place hands on each patient while reciting specific prayers, often including, "The king touches you, God heals you." Patients received specially minted touch pieces, coins believed to continue the healing process after ceremonies ended. The entire ritual was designed to create profound spiritual significance and royal power. What makes these ceremonies particularly interesting to modern researchers is how systematically they were documented. Royal records include detailed lists of patients treated, their conditions, and often follow-up reports on recovery. These records suggest success rates of 60 to 80%. Patients reported significant improvement within months of ceremonies. For centuries, medical historians assumed these success rates were either fraudulent or resulted from misdiagnosis. But modern analysis of historical records, combined with understanding of actual medical conditions involved, suggests a more complex picture. Scrofula, the primary condition treated through royal touch, is now known to be tuberculosis that can indeed go into spontaneous remission, particularly in patients whose immune systems are strengthened through improved nutrition, reduced stress, and positive psychological states. Many other conditions commonly brought to royal touching ceremonies, skin diseases, joint problems, chronic conditions, are also known to respond to psychological and social interventions. The royal touching ceremony provided exactly the kind of psychological and social support that modern research has shown to be therapeutically effective. Patients received individual attention from the most powerful person in the kingdom, participated in elaborate rituals affirming their value and dignity, and became part of communities of fellow sufferers supporting each other through healing. The journey to attend ceremonies was itself therapeutically significant. Patients often traveled for weeks, staying in monasteries and religious institutions along the way. This journey removed them from stressful daily circumstances, provided opportunities for rest and reflection, and created sense of pilgrimage that enhanced psychological impact of eventual ceremony. Archaeological analysis of surviving touch pieces has revealed sophisticated understanding of chemistry and material science. The coins were often made from precious metals and contained trace amounts of substances believed to have medicinal properties. Chemical analysis shows they included materials with genuine antimicrobial properties. Modern medical research has provided explanations for why royal touching might have been genuinely effective. The placebo effect produces measurable physiological changes, including improved immune function, reduced inflammation, and accelerated healing. Royal touching ceremonies were designed to maximize placebo effects through multiple psychological mechanisms. But effectiveness went beyond simple placebo effects. Ceremonies provided what modern medicine recognizes as important therapeutic factors: stress reduction, social support, improved self-esteem, and integration into healing communities that continued providing support after initial intervention. For many patients, particularly from lower social classes, royal touching may have been their first experience of being treated with dignity and respect by authority figures. The psychological impact of having the monarch personally attend to their suffering could have profound effects on sense of self-worth and belief in capacity to heal. Archaeological excavations of medieval sites have provided insights into effectiveness of royal touching protocols. Analysis of remains buried during major outbreaks shows clear evidence of medical intervention, and communities with active royal touching had significantly lower mortality rates than those without medical care. The decline of royal touching in the 18th and 19th centuries reflected changing attitudes toward both monarchy and medicine rather than recognition of ineffectiveness. As Enlightenment rationalism challenged beliefs in divine kingship, and as scientific medicine developed more effective treatments, there was less social support for healing practices depending on supernatural intervention. But elements of royal touching tradition persisted in other forms, and many therapeutic principles were incorporated into new healing approaches. Recognition that psychological and social factors play important roles in health and recovery became fundamental to modern medicine. Today, as we rediscover importance of therapeutic relationships between healer and patient, royal touching no longer seems like primitive superstition. Instead, it appears as sophisticated understanding of psychological and social dimensions of healing that modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate. The elaborate ceremonies that brought kings and queens into direct personal contact with their most vulnerable subjects represented healthcare delivery that prioritized human dignity, community support, and holistic approaches to healing. While we may no longer believe in divine power of royal hands, we can recognize wisdom of healing practices that treat patients as whole human beings rather than simply collections of symptoms. As we watch dawn strengthen outside our windows, thinking about those ceremonies where monarchs placed hands on heads of suffering subjects, we might reflect on what those rituals reveal about the nature of healing and the relationship between power and care. Royal touch may have been based on incorrect theories about divine kingship, but it created healing relationships that genuinely helped people in ways that purely biochemical approaches sometimes fail to match. The ceremonies embodied principles about human dignity, community responsibility for health, and importance of hope and faith in healing that remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. In our age of high-technology medicine and evidence-based practice, we sometimes forget that healing has always been as much about human connection as medical intervention. Royal touching ceremonies remind us that sometimes the most powerful medicine is recognition that suffering matters, that individual lives have value, and that communities have obligations to provide hope and support to their most vulnerable members. The divine right of kings may be gone, but the human right to compassionate care remains. Perhaps that's the real legacy of royal touch, not questionable belief that monarchs possessed supernatural healing powers, but enduring truth that healing happens most effectively within relationships of genuine care, respect, and human dignity. The sun climbs higher now, bringing with it the full light of day. Our journey through medieval mysteries draws toward its close, but there are still stories to tell, still truths to uncover in the borderlands between legend and history. As morning light grows stronger and night's mysteries begin to fade, let me tell you about one of medieval Europe's most persistent and troubling legends, the story of the Wandering Jew, a figure condemned to roam the earth until the second coming as punishment for mocking Christ on his way to crucifixion. For centuries, this was understood to be pure religious allegory, a moral tale designed to illustrate divine justice and consequences of rejecting Christian salvation. But as historians began tracing origins and evolution of this legend, they discovered something unexpected. The story appears to have been based on encounters with real individuals whose circumstances and behavior so closely matched the legendary figure that medieval communities became convinced they had met the actual wandering Jew in flesh. The earliest known version appears in 13th century chronicles, but the story was already well established in oral tradition. According to the tale, when Christ was carrying his cross to Calvary, he paused to rest against the wall of a Jewish shoemaker's house. The shoemaker drove Christ away, telling him to hurry along to his destiny. Christ cursed the man to wander the earth without rest or death until the day of his return. What made this legend different from other medieval religious stories was its insistence on contemporary relevance. Unlike tales set in biblical times or distant lands, the wandering Jew was said to still be alive, still wandering, still encountering people in the present day. Medieval chroniclers regularly recorded claimed sightings, always describing him as a middle-aged man with distinctive appearance who spoke of ancient times with first-hand knowledge. For modern historians, these sighting reports initially seemed like obvious fabrications. But as researchers analyzed accounts more systematically, patterns emerged suggesting something more complex was happening. Reported encounters often occurred in frontier regions, border areas, or communities experiencing social upheaval. The figure was typically described as a solitary traveler who appeared unexpectedly, displayed remarkable knowledge of distant places and ancient events, spoke multiple languages fluently, and disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. These characteristics matched the profile of a specific type of medieval figure, the long-distance trader, diplomat, or scholar who traveled extensively across cultural and religious boundaries. Such individuals were rare, but not unknown, and their unusual knowledge and appearance could easily have seemed supernatural to isolated communities with little contact with the wider world. Archaeological evidence has provided support for this interpretation. Excavations of medieval sites have uncovered evidence of regular long-distance travel and cultural exchange far more extensive than previously realized. Analysis of trade goods, linguistic borrowings, and cultural artifacts shows that networks of communication and commerce connected even remote communities to wider systems of exchange. The people who maintained these networks, merchants, diplomats, pilgrims, scholars, often lived lives remarkably similar to the legendary wandering Jew. They traveled constantly, had no permanent homes, possessed extensive knowledge of different cultures and languages, and often maintained activities across multiple generations, creating family traditions of wandering that could seem endless to outside observers. Some long-distance travelers may have been Jewish merchants or scholars displaced by periodic expulsions and persecutions. Medieval Europe saw recurring waves of anti-Jewish violence that forced entire communities to flee and establish new lives in distant regions. Survivors of these expulsions often became wanderers by necessity, maintaining networks of family and business connections spanning vast distances. DNA analysis of medieval Jewish communities has revealed extensive patterns of migration and intermarriage supporting this interpretation. Genetic markers show medieval Jewish populations were far more mobile than previously thought, with individuals and families regularly moving between communities separated by hundreds of miles. These migration patterns could have created situations where the same families or individuals appeared in different regions over decades or centuries, always as outsiders with mysterious backgrounds and extensive knowledge of distant places. To local populations with little experience of such mobility, these recurring appearances might well have seemed supernatural. Historical records reveal specific individuals whose lives closely match legendary characteristics. One interesting case is Cartaphilus, mentioned in several 13th century sources as a man who claimed to have been present at Christ's crucifixion and was condemned to wander until the end of time. Contemporary accounts describe Cartaphilus as speaking multiple languages, displaying detailed knowledge of biblical events, and appearing ageless despite claiming to have lived for over 1,000 years. He was reported to be a skilled craftsman and merchant who traveled throughout Europe and the Middle East, always alone, always moving on after brief community stays. Modern analysis suggests Cartaphilus may have been a specific historical individual, possibly a Jewish merchant or scholar who had adopted this identity as a way of explaining his extensive travels and unusual knowledge. By claiming to be the legendary wandering Jew, he could account for his presence in distant regions and familiarity with multiple cultures without revealing details about his actual background or business. This strategy would have been particularly valuable for individuals engaged in sensitive activities like diplomatic missions, intelligence gathering, or trade in restricted goods. The identity of the wandering Jew provided a kind of supernatural diplomatic immunity that could protect travelers from suspicion or persecution while allowing them to move freely across political and religious boundaries. The psychological and social functions of the wandering Jew legend were also significant. For medieval Christian communities, the figure served as a powerful symbol of consequences of rejecting Christian salvation. But he also represented something more complex: the possibility of encountering the divine or supernatural in everyday life, and obligation to show hospitality to strangers who might be more than they appeared. Many reported encounters emphasized themes of hospitality, charity, and the hidden nature of divine testing. The figure would appear as humble traveler seeking shelter or assistance, and the way he was treated would determine whether communities received blessings or punishments. These stories served important social functions by encouraging communities to welcome strangers and provide assistance to travelers. In a world where travel was dangerous and accommodation often unavailable, the legend helped maintain networks of hospitality essential for communication and commerce. The legend also provided framework for understanding cultural difference and diversity. The wandering Jew was typically portrayed as someone with extensive knowledge of different languages, customs, and religious practices. Rather than being feared for this knowledge, he was often respected as a source of wisdom and information about the wider world. This positive interpretation of cultural difference was somewhat unusual in medieval Europe, where outsiders were often viewed with suspicion. The legend created space for accepting and even celebrating the kind of cosmopolitan knowledge that came from extensive travel and cross-cultural experience. Modern research into migration patterns, refugee experiences, and diaspora communities has provided new insights into historical reality behind the legend. The figure represents not supernatural punishment, but very human experiences of displacement, loss, and search for belonging that have characterized human experience throughout history. Contemporary DNA analysis and genealogical research have traced specific family lines that maintained patterns of long-distance migration across multiple generations, creating exactly the kind of recurring appearances in distant communities that could have inspired beliefs about immortal wanderers. The legend ultimately reveals more about medieval attitudes toward travel, cultural difference, and divine intervention than about any specific supernatural figure. But it also demonstrates how mythological narratives can emerge from and interact with historical realities in complex ways that blur boundaries between legend and truth. As we welcome the full light of morning, thinking about those mysterious travelers who appeared unexpectedly in medieval communities with their stories of distant lands and ancient times, we might reflect on how legends serve to make sense of experiences that exceed our normal categories of understanding. The wandering Jew may have been myth, but the wanderers who inspired that myth were real. People displaced by persecution, driven by curiosity, or drawn by opportunity, to lives of constant movement across a world far more connected and cosmopolitan than we often realize. Their stories remind us that human mobility and cultural exchange have always been more extensive than official histories suggest, and that the most enduring legends often preserve memories of human experiences that would otherwise be forgotten. The wandering Jew wanders still, not as supernatural figure but as symbol of all the displaced, exiled, and perpetually traveling souls who carry memories and wisdom of distant places into our own familiar worlds. The sun grows brighter as we move toward our next mystery, one that challenges everything we think we know about the limits of human endurance. As the sun climbs higher and chases away the last shadows of night, let me tell you about one of medieval Christianity's most extraordinary claims, the accounts of saints and holy people who were said to be completely immune to fire, who could walk through flames unharmed, handle burning coals with bare hands, and even sleep peacefully in furnaces without suffering injury. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as pious fiction, hagiographical exaggeration designed to inspire faith rather than record fact. But as researchers began investigating both historical records and physiological possibilities behind fire immunity, they discovered something remarkable. While supernatural protection from flame may be impossible, the human body can indeed develop extraordinary resistance to heat and fire under specific conditions. Picture St. Lawrence, who according to legend was roasted alive on a gridiron but remained cheerful throughout his ordeal, even joking with his executioners about when they should turn him over. Or imagine Catherine of Siena, whose ecstatic trances reportedly made her immune to pain and damage from fire. These weren't just legendary figures from distant times. They were people whose alleged fire immunity was witnessed by contemporary observers who recorded their experiences in detailed accounts. What makes these cases particularly intriguing is the specificity and consistency of reported phenomena. Witnesses didn't just claim saints were protected from fire. They described specific behaviors and physical responses, suggesting genuine physiological changes. Saints were often described as entering trance-like states before demonstrating fire immunity, showing alterations in breathing, pulse, and skin temperature that prepared their bodies for exposure to extreme heat. Modern research into firewalking, extreme heat exposure, and altered states of consciousness has revealed that the human body is capable of much greater resistance to heat and flame than commonly believed. Under specific conditions, including proper preparation, psychological conditioning, and physiological changes associated with trance states, people can indeed withstand temperatures and exposures that would normally cause severe burns. The key factors enabling fire immunity include the Leidenfrost effect, where protective vapor layers form between skin and extremely hot surfaces, controlled breathing techniques that alter blood flow and skin temperature, psychological states that reduce pain sensitivity and fear responses, and specific contact methods that minimize heat transfer and exposure time. Archaeological evidence supports the historical reality of fire immunity demonstrations in medieval religious contexts. Excavations of monasteries and churches have uncovered specialized furnaces, fire pits, and apparatus that appear designed for controlled fire exposure experiments. These installations show evidence of repeated use and careful engineering, suggesting systematic rather than spontaneous demonstrations. Chemical analysis of medieval religious sites has revealed traces of substances that may have enhanced fire resistance, oils, salts, and compounds that could provide some protection against heat when applied to skin or clothing. While these couldn't provide complete immunity, they could reduce risk of serious burns during brief heat exposures. But perhaps most significantly, modern research into extreme religious practices has documented contemporary cases of fire immunity that closely parallel medieval accounts. Certain religious traditions still maintain practices involving controlled fire exposure, and scientific observation has revealed physiological and psychological mechanisms that make such feats possible. Firewalking ceremonies, practiced in various cultures worldwide, demonstrate that properly prepared individuals can walk across beds of burning coals without suffering burns. High-speed photography and thermal imaging show successful firewalkers minimize contact time, maintain proper positioning, and often enter altered consciousness states that affect pain perception and physiological heat responses. Similar principles apply to other forms of fire resistance. People trained extensively in controlling autonomic nervous system responses can alter skin temperature, blood flow, and pain sensitivity in ways providing significant protection against heat exposure. These changes, while not supernatural, can be dramatic enough to seem miraculous to untrained observers. The psychological dimensions are equally important. Fear and anxiety can make burns worse by causing muscle tension, increased blood flow to skin, and other responses increasing heat sensitivity. Conversely, states of deep meditation, religious ecstasy, or trance can reduce these negative responses and activate protective mechanisms that increase heat tolerance. Medieval religious training often included extensive practice in meditation, prayer, and techniques that could produce psychological states associated with fire resistance. Saints demonstrating fire immunity typically had years or decades of experience in contemplative practices that altered consciousness and gave them exceptional control over physical responses. The social and religious context of fire immunity demonstrations was crucial to their effectiveness. These displays typically occurred during religious ceremonies where audiences were already primed to expect miraculous events. The combination of religious atmosphere, community support, and heightened emotional states could enhance both performer abilities and witness perceptions. Documentation from medieval religious communities shows fire immunity demonstrations were often preceded by extensive periods of fasting, prayer, and spiritual preparation. These practices could produce physiological changes, altered metabolism, reduced pain sensitivity, enhanced autonomic nervous system control, that would increase likelihood of successfully withstanding fire exposure. But historical records also reveal that not all attempts at demonstrating fire immunity were successful. There are documented cases of would-be saints who suffered severe burns or death while attempting to prove their holiness through fire exposure. These failures were typically interpreted as evidence that individuals lacked sufficient faith or had committed hidden sins preventing divine protection. Modern analysis of these failed cases provides insights into real limitations of fire resistance techniques. Even under optimal conditions, fire immunity has strict limits regarding temperature, exposure time, and specific types of fire contact possible. Attempts to exceed these limits, whether through overconfidence, peer pressure, or genuine belief in supernatural protection, could and did result in serious injury or death. Contemporary research into extreme human performance continues revealing new possibilities for what the human body and mind can accomplish under extraordinary conditions. Studies of meditation masters, extreme athletes, and individuals with unusual neurological conditions have documented abilities that would have seemed impossible to earlier researchers. Some modern practitioners of firewalking and heat resistance have been studied extensively using scientific instruments measuring skin temperature, pain responses, and other physiological indicators during fire exposure. These studies confirm genuine fire resistance is possible and have identified mechanisms that make it work, while establishing clear limits on what can be achieved through natural means. The implications extend beyond fire immunity. Many other supposedly supernatural abilities attributed to medieval saints might be based on real but misunderstood human capabilities. Extreme fasting, apparent immunity to cold, extraordinary physical strength, and other miraculous feats might reflect exceptional but natural human abilities rather than divine intervention. This doesn't diminish spiritual significance for medieval believers, but provides different framework for understanding how such phenomena could occur. Rather than requiring supernatural explanation, fire immunity and similar abilities represent outer limits of human potential, extraordinary but achievable states emerging when physical training, psychological preparation, and optimal conditions converge. The fireproof saints may not have been protected by divine miracle, but they may have discovered and demonstrated real human capabilities that most people never develop or explore. Their achievements represent not suspension of natural law, but full expression of natural possibilities that remain largely untapped in ordinary human experience. As we move into full morning light, thinking about those medieval holy people who walked fearlessly into flames that would have terrified ordinary mortals, we might reflect on what their example suggests about untapped potential lying dormant within all human beings. The fireproof saints discovered that faith, properly cultivated and applied, could indeed move mountains, or at least allow them to walk unharmed through fire. Whether we interpret their protection as supernatural intervention or natural ability developed to extraordinary degrees, their legacy challenges us to consider what other impossible things might become possible through proper preparation, unwavering faith, and willingness to test boundaries of what we believe to be true. Their flames have long been extinguished, but their example still burns bright, reminding us that the greatest limitations we face may not be in the world around us, but in our assumptions about what human beings are truly capable of achieving when they push beyond boundaries of ordinary experience. As the morning sun climbs steadily higher, we come now to one of our darkest tales, a ritual so horrifying that scholars refuse to believe it could be real. As the morning sun climbs steadily upward, casting long shadows that remind us how darkness of history can persist even in brightest light, let me tell you about one of the most horrifying execution methods ever described. The blood eagle, a ritual killing attributed to Vikings that was so grotesque, so seemingly impossible to perform, that historians dismissed it for centuries as pure literary invention. But recent archaeological discoveries and forensic analysis have forced scholars to reconsider whether this nightmarish procedure might actually have been performed, at least in some cases, exactly as the sagas describe. The blood eagle appears in several Icelandic sagas, most notably in stories of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, who allegedly performed the ritual on King Ella of Northumbria to avenge their father's death. According to these accounts, the victim would be placed face down, and the executioner would cut through ribs from behind, breaking them away from the spine. The lungs would then be pulled out through the opening and draped over the victim's shoulders like wings, while salt was poured into the wounds. The sagas describe this as both extreme torture and sacrifice to Odin, the Norse god associated with death, warfare, and ritual sacrifice. The victim was said to remain conscious throughout the procedure, and their suffering was considered an offering that would ensure divine favor for the executioner and their cause. For modern historians, the blood eagle presented multiple problems. First, it seemed medically impossible. The human body simply couldn't survive the trauma described. Second, there was no archaeological evidence despite extensive excavation of Viking sites. Third, the accounts appeared only in literary sources written centuries after supposed events, making them suspect as historical evidence. Most scholars concluded the blood eagle was a literary device created by saga writers to demonstrate extreme Viking revenge culture. The procedure was too elaborate, too ritualistic, too precisely described to be anything but fiction. Medieval horror story designed to thrill and terrify audiences rather than record historical fact. But this interpretation began changing in the 1990s, when archaeologists working in England began uncovering burial sites containing human remains with unusual trauma patterns. Several skeletons were found with rib damage consistent with deliberate cutting and breaking from behind, combined with evidence of extensive soft tissue removal from chest cavities. The most significant discovery came from a 9th century burial site near Repton in Derbyshire, where archaeologists uncovered what appeared to be a Viking war grave containing hundreds of bodies. Among these remains were several individuals who had suffered extensive trauma to ribs and chest cavity in patterns closely matching blood eagle descriptions. Forensic analysis revealed cut marks on ribs that appeared to have been made by sharp metal instruments, consistent with Viking age weapons and tools. The pattern of cuts suggested ribs had been systematically severed from the spine, exactly as described in sagas. Most significantly, the positioning and condition of remains suggested procedures had been performed on living victims rather than corpses. Computer modeling based on skeletal evidence has confirmed that the blood eagle procedure, while extremely traumatic, could indeed be performed on a living victim and might allow them to survive for the duration described in literary sources. The key factor is that cutting through ribs from behind doesn't necessarily puncture lungs immediately, and pulling lungs out through the opening might not cause immediate death if done carefully. However, victims would certainly die from blood loss, shock, and respiratory failure within minutes or hours. The saga's claims that victims remained conscious and able to speak throughout the ritual are consistent with what medical experts know about trauma responses and the body's ability to maintain consciousness during extreme stress. But perhaps most significantly, archaeological evidence has been found not just in England, but also in Scandinavia itself, at sites associated with religious ritual and royal burials. Several high-status Viking graves have been found to contain individuals who appear to have died from blood eagle procedures, suggesting the practice was not just an instrument of warfare, but also a form of religious sacrifice. Analysis of these Scandinavian finds has revealed additional details supporting the ritual nature of the blood eagle. Victims were often buried with grave goods and in positions suggesting they were considered honored dead rather than simple execution victims. Some show evidence of having been prepared with special foods or substances before death, consistent with religious sacrifice practices. The religious dimensions are crucial to understanding why such an extreme procedure might have been developed and maintained. Odin was associated with sacrifice, death, and acquisition of wisdom through suffering. According to Norse mythology, Odin hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge of runes. The blood eagle may have been conceived as a way of dedicating particularly important enemies to Odin, offering their prolonged suffering as a gift to the god while demonstrating the power and ruthlessness of Viking warriors. The specific imagery of lungs draped over victims' shoulders like wings may have been intended to evoke ravens, Odin's sacred birds who flew across battlefields to collect souls of the dead. This interpretation is supported by runestone evidence and archaeological finds showing the central importance of sacrifice in Viking religious practice. The Norse regularly practiced both animal and human sacrifice at religious festivals and important occasions, developing elaborate rituals designed to maximize spiritual value of these offerings. The blood eagle can be understood as an extreme form of this sacrificial practice, reserved for the most important victims and crucial occasions. The complexity and duration would have demonstrated both the dedication of sacrificers and the significance they attach to outcomes they hope to achieve. But archaeological evidence also suggests the blood eagle was not common practice, even by Viking standards. The number of confirmed cases is small, concentrated around specific time periods and locations associated with particular military campaigns or religious events. This rarity helps explain why the procedure survived primarily in literary rather than historical sources. It was probably performed infrequently enough that most Vikings never witnessed it directly, but dramatically enough that stories spread widely throughout Norse culture and were preserved in oral traditions that eventually became written sagas. Modern forensic techniques continue revealing new details about how blood eagle procedures were actually performed. Analysis of tool marks on skeletal remains has identified specific types of weapons and implements used, while studies of wound patterns have revealed the sequence of cuts and level of anatomical knowledge required to perform the procedure successfully. Some evidence suggests Blood Eagle practitioners may have had specialized medical knowledge that allowed them to prolong victims' survival and maximize their suffering. The precision of cuts and systematic nature of the procedure indicate training and experience that went beyond simple torture or execution. This medical dimension raises disturbing questions about the relationship between healing and harming in Viking culture. The same anatomical knowledge used to treat wounds and save lives could also be applied to inflict precise and prolonged torture. Some scholars suggest the Blood Eagle may have been performed by individuals who served as both healers and ritual specialists in Viking society. The psychological impact on both victims and witnesses was probably as important as religious or military functions. The extreme nature would have created powerful psychological effects extending far beyond immediate participants. For Vikings who performed the ritual, it served as demonstration of their power over life and death, devotion to their gods, and willingness to go to any lengths to achieve goals. For enemies, witnessing or hearing about Blood Eagle executions would have created terror and demoralization that could affect military campaign outcomes. The Blood Eagle ultimately represents one of the darkest aspects of Viking culture, willingness to inflict extreme suffering in service of religious and military objectives. But it also demonstrates sophisticated ritual practices and complex belief systems that characterize Norse society at its height. As we move deeper into mourning, thinking about those ancient procedures that pushed boundaries of human cruelty in service of divine purpose, we might reflect on how thin the line can be between religious devotion and ritualized violence, between honor and horror. The Blood Eagle reminds us that some of the most disturbing aspects of human history are also among the most real, and that our ancestors were capable of both extraordinary creativity and extraordinary cruelty in their attempts to understand and influence forces that shape their world. The sun climbs higher now, and as we approach the final mysteries of our journey, we carry with us the sobering knowledge that human beings are capable of both remarkable compassion and horrifying cruelty, sometimes within the same culture, sometimes in service of the same beliefs. But there are gentler mysteries ahead. As the morning light strengthens and we prepare to emerge from the deepest mysteries of night, let me tell you about one of medieval Christianity's most puzzling phenomena, the incorruptible saints, holy people whose bodies were said to remain perfectly preserved long after death, showing no signs of decay even after decades or centuries in their tombs. For generations, these accounts were dismissed as pious fraud or wishful thinking, the kind of miraculous claims that credulous believers might accept but rational observers could safely ignore. But modern forensic science and archaeological investigation have revealed that some of these cases appear to be genuine, that under specific conditions, human bodies can indeed remain remarkably well preserved for extraordinary periods, and that medieval claims may have been based on careful observation of real phenomena rather than religious fantasy. Picture walking into a medieval church and being shown the perfectly preserved body of a saint who died centuries earlier, their skin still flexible, their features still recognizable, sometimes even exhibiting pleasant fragrances instead of the odors of decomposition. This wasn't just a one-time miracle. It was a recurring phenomenon that the Catholic Church eventually incorporated into its canonization process as evidence of divine favor. The tradition goes back to Christianity's earliest centuries, but reached its height in medieval Europe, where preserved saints' bodies became objects of pilgrimage and veneration. Unlike Egyptian mummification, which involved deliberate preservation techniques, incorruption was believed to occur spontaneously through God's intervention. What made these cases different from ordinary preservation wasn't just lack of decay, but specific characteristics witnesses reported. Bodies remained flexible rather than rigid. Skin retained natural color and texture. They sometimes exhibited sweet fragrances, and in some cases appeared to continue subtle movements like breathing. The most famous cases include Saint Catherine of Bologna, whose body remained lifelike for centuries after her death in 1463, and Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, who showed no signs of decay when exhumed decades after her death in 1879. These weren't just medieval legends. They were documented cases that church authorities investigated systematically. Modern forensic scientists studying these phenomena have discovered that while supernatural preservation is impossible, there are specific natural conditions that can produce preservation effects closely matching historical descriptions. The key factors include extremely dry environments that inhibit bacterial growth, constant cool temperatures that slow decomposition, alkaline soil conditions that neutralize decay-producing acids, and absence of oxygen. When these conditions occur together, human bodies can remain remarkably well preserved for centuries. The preservation isn't perfect. It's not the same as being alive, but it can be dramatic enough to seem miraculous to observers who don't understand the underlying processes. Archaeological analysis of medieval burial sites has revealed that many locations where incorruptible saints were interred had environmental conditions ideal for natural preservation. Churches built on high ground with excellent drainage, stone tombs providing consistent temperature and humidity control, and burial practices that limited oxygen exposure all contributed to creating these preservation conditions. Chemical analysis of soil samples from saint burial sites has confirmed the presence of minerals and substances that would naturally inhibit decomposition. Some locations show preservation conditions comparable to famous archaeological sites where ancient bodies have been naturally mummified for thousands of years. But perhaps most significantly, modern techniques have been applied to some allegedly incorruptible saints themselves. In cases where church authorities permitted scientific examination, researchers have been able to determine actual preservation states and identify the mechanisms responsible. The results have been mixed but illuminating. Some supposed incorruptibles have been found to be partially or completely artificial, wax figures, masked skeletal remains, or bodies that had been secretly embalmed, but others have shown genuine preservation that can be explained through natural processes rather than supernatural intervention. Saint Bernadette, for example, was found to be remarkably well preserved when examined in the 20th century, but scientific analysis revealed that the preservation resulted from the specific environmental conditions of her burial site rather than divine miracle. The cool, dry conditions in her stone tomb had created an environment that naturally inhibited decomposition. What makes these findings particularly interesting is that they don't necessarily invalidate the religious significance believers attach to incorruption. Medieval Christians observing these preserved bodies were witnessing genuine phenomena. They simply interpreted them through the conceptual frameworks available to them. The fact that certain holy people were buried in locations promoting preservation might be seen as evidence of divine providence working through natural means rather than supernatural suspension of natural law. From this perspective, incorruption becomes a sign of God working through nature rather than against it. Modern preservation science has revealed that people who lived ascetic lifestyles, fasting regularly, avoiding alcohol and rich foods, spending time in meditation, might have had body chemistry more conducive to preservation after death. The same practices associated with sanctity might also have created conditions that promoted incorruption. For medieval communities, preserved saints' bodies served as tangible evidence of divine presence and favor. They provided focal points for prayer, pilgrimage, and community identity that helped maintain religious faith during difficult times. The examination and veneration of incorruptible saints created rituals that strengthened social bonds and provided frameworks for dealing with death and loss. But the incorruption tradition also created problems. The desire to have local saints led to competition between communities and sometimes to fabrication of miraculous preservation. Church authorities had to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for investigating alleged cases and distinguishing genuine phenomena from fraud. The development of these investigative procedures contributed to early forms of forensic science. Church committees learned to document preservation carefully, compare cases across different locations and time periods, and develop criteria for evaluating claims about miraculous preservation. As we move toward our final mysteries, thinking about those preserved saints whose bodies defied the normal processes of decay, we might reflect on what preservation means and why it matters to us. The incorruptible saints represent humanity's eternal struggle with mortality, our desire to believe that death is not the end, that something of value persists beyond the dissolution of flesh. Whether preserved through divine intervention or natural chemistry, these bodies served as powerful symbols of hope and continuity that helped medieval communities make sense of loss and find meaning in the face of mortality. They remind us that the boundary between natural and supernatural, between science and faith, is often less clear than we might suppose. The saints may not have conquered death through miraculous preservation, but they did achieve a kind of immortality through the stories told about them, the communities that formed around their memory, and the ongoing search for understanding that their cases continue to inspire. As the sun grows brighter and we prepare for one final dark tale, we might remember that not all medieval systems were as benign as misguided medicine or honest mistakes about natural phenomena. As we near the end of our journey through medieval mysteries, the morning sun now bright and warm, let me tell you about one of history's most chilling documents, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, a 15th century manual that transformed scattered folk beliefs about witchcraft into a systematic program of persecution that would claim tens of thousands of lives across Europe. This wasn't just another collection of medieval superstitions. The Malleus was something far more dangerous, a sophisticated manual that provided legal frameworks, interrogation techniques,